Hey guys. Alright, welcome back. Or welcome for the first time. However you arrived here tonight, you made it. And that's the important part. So go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe lower the brightness on your screen just a little. Let the room get quiet. Let your shoulders drop. There's nowhere you need to be for a while. Tonight, we're not chasing epic battles or heroic legends. We're doing something much calmer. Much stranger. Tonight, we're talking about laws. Medieval laws. And not the sensible ones. Not the, don't murder people, kind. The other ones. The ones that make you pause and quietly ask yourself, why did anyone think this was necessary? Asterisk. Because medieval Europe was obsessed with rules. Not order, exactly. More like, control. Control of clothing. Control of food. Control of leisure. Control of how long your shoes were allowed to be. Control of what you did with a ball. Control of what day you were allowed to be happy. And the results were, well, ridiculous. So let's ease into it. Slowly, gently, like drifting through a very poorly organized legal code written by people who were deeply stressed about society collapsing at any moment. We begin, naturally, with shoes. Because of course we do. In the late Middle Ages, fashion took a turn. A strange turn. A turn so sharp it nearly poked someone's eye out. Literally, shoes began to get pointy. Very pointy. These were called poulaines asterisk, and they were long, exaggerated, curled at the tip, and wildly impractical. Some were so long they had to be tied to the wearer's knee with a string, just to keep them from flopping around like depressed leather noodles. Naturally, the ruling classes loved them, which meant everyone else wanted them too. And that, apparently, was unacceptable. So governments stepped in. Kings, councils, and city authorities across England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire passed laws limiting how long your shoes were allowed to be. Not metaphorically. Not reasonable length. Actual measurements. 2 inches for commoners. A bit more if you were a merchant. Nobles could go longer. Because of course they could. This wasn't about safety. Or tripping hazards. This was about class. About making sure you could look at someone's feet and immediately know your place in the social hierarchy. Nothing says, you are poor, quite like aggressively short shoes. And if you broke the rule, fines, confiscation, public humiliation. Sometimes the tips were literally chopped off in public. Which feels excessive, but medieval law loved a visual lesson. And the irony, of course, is that pointy shoes were utterly useless. You couldn't work in them. You couldn't walk far. You definitely couldn't fight. But that was the point. If you didn't need to do anything useful, you must be important. Let's float gently away from footwear and drift toward sports. Or rather, what passed for sports in medieval England. Because medieval authorities absolutely hated games. Especially soccer. Or something vaguely resembling soccer. A chaotic village-wide brawl involving an inflated animal bladder and no clear rules. This was called mob football. And it was less a game and more a socially sanctioned riot. Villages would kick, punch, shove, and drag a ball from one end of town to the other. People got injured, property got destroyed, occasionally someone died, and the crown looked at all this and thought, you know what the real problem here is? Archery practice. Quote, you see, English kings were obsessed with archery. Longbows won wars. Longbows required practice. And if the peasants were busy breaking windows and ribs over a ball, they weren't practicing their aim. So football was banned. Repeatedly. Over and over. For centuries. Edward II banned it. Edward III banned it. Henry IV banned it. Henry VIII banned it. At this point, banning football was basically a royal tradition. Like getting crowned or declaring war on France. The laws always sounded deeply annoyed. Football was described as vain, idle, nuisance-filled, and productive of great evils. Which is an impressive amount of disdain for a game with no referees and one ball. Did people stop playing? Of course not. They never do. Instead, they played anyway. Quietly, or loudly, depending on how much they cared. Which tells us something important about medieval law. Enforcement was optimistic. Now let's drift indoors. Into the home. Into the kitchen. Into the deeply regulated world of food. Because medieval governments loved telling people what they were allowed to eat. These were called sumptuary laws. And they controlled everything from clothing to banquets to spices. The logic was simple. If common people started eating fancy food, society might collapse. Or at least become confusing. Spices, especially, were tightly regulated. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves. These were luxury items. Status symbols. If you were poor and your stew tasted too good, someone might start asking questions. In some places, only nobles could serve certain dishes at weddings. In others, the number of courses was limited based on your social rank. You could literally be fined for hosting a dinner that was too impressive. Imagine being arrested for excessive hospitality. And again, this wasn't about health. It was about visibility. About making sure wealth stayed visible. Controlled. Predictable. Medieval rulers were terrified of blending. Of social lines getting blurry. Because once people start dressing alike, eating alike, and acting alike, they might start asking why some families get castles and others get mud. Let's glide onward. Out of the kitchen. Back into the streets. Where people are laughing. Which was also a problem. In some medieval towns, laughter itself was regulated. Not officially banned, exactly. But festivals, games, and celebrations were heavily controlled. Certain days were approved for joy. Other days were not. Unauthorized fun was suspicious. Dancing in the streets could be illegal. Singing could be illegal. Playing music without permission could be illegal. Because noise meant gatherings. And gatherings meant potential rebellion. Or worse, opinions. Some towns banned games on Sundays. Others banned them on feast days. Others banned them during harvest. At a certain point, it became easier to list the days you were allowed to have fun. And this leads us gently to one of the most medieval laws imaginable, laws about idleness. Being idle was a crime. Not metaphorically, literally. In England, vagrancy laws made it illegal to be unemployed. If you didn't have a master, or a trade, or visible work, you could be arrested, whipped, branded, expelled. This was especially harsh after the Black Death. When labor was scarce, workers demanded higher wages, and authorities responded by making it illegal to ask for more money. The law essentially said, you will work. You will work for the same pay as before the plague. And you will like it. Or else. Freedom, medieval style. Let's gently slide back into the realm of fashion. Because medieval law could not stop thinking about what people wore. Bright colors were restricted. Certain fabrics were forbidden. Fur was regulated. Silk was controlled. Even buttons could be controversial. In some places, prostitutes were legally required to dress differently. Specific colors. Specific markings. Not for safety. Not for clarity. But for public shaming. And if that sounds harsh, remember that medieval law believed shame was a feature, not a bug. Which brings us, slowly, calmly, to one of the strangest categories of medieval legislation, morality laws. Adultery, blasphemy, swearing, gambling, these were all regulated, punished, and monitored. Not because everyone followed them, but because rulers wanted to be seen enforcing virtue. In some towns, you could be fined for swearing. In others, for playing dice. In others, for staying out too late. Curfews were common. Bells rang. Gates closed. The city literally went to bed. And if you were caught wandering after dark, suspicion followed, because nothing good happened at night. According to medieval lawmakers, who clearly did not enjoy nightlife. As we settle into this rhythm of absurd regulation, a pattern emerges. Medieval laws weren't really about order. They were about anxiety, about fear of change, fear of chaos, fear of people doing things without permission. Shoes, games, food, fun, work, everything had to be categorized, ranked, and controlled. Because a world without clear rules was terrifying. And yet, despite all of this, people ignored them. Constantly, cheerfully, relentlessly. They wore long shoes anyway. They played football anyway. They danced anyway. They laughed anyway. They lived, which may be the most comforting thing of all. So let's keep drifting, because we've only just begun. And medieval lawmakers still have many, many strange ideas left to share. Alright, welcome back. If you're still here, excellent. That means either you're relaxed, or you forgot to turn this off. Both are valid outcomes. So let's sink a little deeper into the medieval mind. A place where everything was dangerous, God was watching, and your neighbor's socks could be a political statement. Because medieval lawmakers did not just regulate actions. They regulated appearances, and intentions, and sometimes vibes, especially vibes. Let's start with hair. Hair was a problem, constantly, for men and women. Too long, too short, too styled, too noticeable. All suspicious. In several medieval cities, men were fined for wearing their hair too long. Long hair suggested vanity, or rebellion, or foreign influence, or moral weakness. Pick one. Sometimes all four. Beards were also regulated. Some places required them, others restricted them, and styles mattered. A well-groomed beard could imply leisure. Leisure implied wealth. Wealth implied power. Power implied threat. So yes, your facial hair could get you in trouble. Women's hair was even more tightly controlled. Married women were often required to cover it. Uncovered hair suggested impropriety, or availability, or independent thought, none of which were appreciated. In certain regions, laws specified how much hair could be visible. A little was acceptable, too much was scandalous. This was enforced with fines, public warnings, and a deeply judgmental gaze from everyone involved. And again, this wasn't about modesty alone. It was about signaling, about keeping everyone in their assigned visual category. Let's drift onward. From hair to hats. Hats were serious business. In medieval Europe, hats were identifiers. Jews were required to wear specific hats in many regions. Pointed hats, bright colors, distinct shapes, not because it was practical, but because medieval societies were deeply invested in visible difference. These laws were framed as clarity. But clarity, in this case, meant segregation. And the same logic applied elsewhere. Certain professions had required clothing. Certain colors were restricted. Certain symbols were mandatory. Medieval law loved symbols. Loved them, because symbols were easier than nuance. Now let's gently wander into the marketplace. A place of noise, smells, negotiation, and aggressive regulation. Markets were tightly controlled. Prices were fixed. Weights were standardized. Bakers could be fined for bread that was too small, or too light, or suspiciously fluffy. There were laws about how bread should look, how it should feel, how it should weigh, because bread wasn't just food. It was survival, and angry bread shortages had a habit of turning into angry riots. So bakers were watched closely. Some towns required bakers to stamp their bread with identifying marks. So if the loaf was bad, everyone knew who to blame. Accountability, medieval style. And if you were caught cheating, punishments could include fines, public humiliation, or being dragged through the streets with the offending loaf tied around your neck. Settle. Now let's ease into another favorite medieval obsession, alcohol. Beer, ale, wine, mead, all deeply regulated, not because medieval people drank too much, though they absolutely did, but because alcohol was big business. Alewives, women who brewed and sold ale, were subject to constant inspection. The quality, the price, the strength, all monitored. There were laws about foam, laws about dilution, laws about pricing based on grain costs. And yes, there were laws against bad ale, which was subjective, and often enforced unevenly, but the threat was always there. Because nothing destabilizes a medieval town faster than disappointing beer. Let's float gently into the home again. Into marriage, which medieval law treated less like romance and more like contract management. Marriage laws were extensive. Who could marry whom? At what age? With whose permission? Under what circumstances? Secret marriages were illegal. Elopement was illegal. Marrying too far above your station was often illegal. Because again, blending. And then there were laws about marital behavior. Husbands had rights. Wives had obligations. And the law was very clear about who was in charge. In some regions, husbands were legally allowed to discipline their wives. With restrictions. But still, The law literally sanctioned domestic control. Adultery laws were also fascinatingly uneven. Women were punished more harshly, consistently, because lineage mattered, property mattered, certainty mattered. A man's infidelity was a moral failing. A woman's was a legal threat. Let's not linger there too long. This is supposed to be relaxing, in a bleak, medieval way. Instead, let's glide toward animals. Animals were also regulated, because medieval law extended to everything that moved, and sometimes things that didn't. Pigs roaming freely were a menace. Laws restricted where they could go, when they could be loose, who was responsible when they caused chaos, which they often did. There are recorded cases of animals being put on trial. Pigs, rats, insects, accused of crimes, tried, sentenced. This wasn't metaphorical. This was legal procedure, with witnesses, and verdicts, because medieval law believed order applied to the entire universe, even to pigs that bit people, especially pigs that bit people. Now let's gently drift toward cleanliness, or the medieval version of it. Public sanitation laws existed, sort of. You weren't supposed to dump waste into the street, or the river, or your neighbor's yard, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some towns had designated dumping areas. Others relied on social pressure, which rarely worked. There were fines for throwing garbage out of windows. And yes, people did that. Frequently, without warning, which made walking through a medieval town a thrilling experience. The laws existed because the problem existed. Repeatedly, persistently, and yet, people kept doing it. Which brings us to an important realization. Medieval law was aspirational. It described the world rulers wanted, not the one they had. Now let's move gently into time itself. Because medieval law also regulated when you could do things. Work hours, prayer hours, market hours, curfews, bells marked everything. The day was divided, controlled, structured. Being out after curfew was suspicious. Being awake at the wrong time was suspicious. Being alone was suspicious. Community was enforced. Privacy was rare, and the law reflected that. It assumed visibility, oversight, participation. Now, let's slowly circle back to leisure. Because medieval authorities never quite gave up on trying to control fun. Board games were sometimes banned. Dice were often banned. Cards, later on, were banned. Gambling was frowned upon. Singing was regulated. Dancing was monitored. Because idle hands, as they say, were the devil's workshop. And medieval lawmakers were absolutely convinced the devil was everywhere. Lurking, waiting, probably inside that game of dice. But here's the quiet truth. The thing that hums beneath all these rules. People kept living. They bent laws, ignored them, broke them gently, repeatedly, with a shrug. Medieval law was loud, but life was louder, and that's what these ridiculous laws reveal. Not control, but fear. Fear of losing grip. Fear of change. Fear that without constant supervision, society would unravel. Which, honestly, is a very human fear. So let's keep drifting, because there are still stranger laws ahead. Laws about bathing. Laws about crying. Laws about silence. Laws about things no one could possibly enforce. And yet, they tried. Because the Middle Ages were many things. Brutal, beautiful, confusing, exhausting, and deeply obsessed with regulating vibes. So stay comfortable, let the rhythm continue. We'll wander further into the legal imagination of a world that desperately wanted order, and never quite got it. Part 3. When the Middle Ages tried to regulate vibes and got weird about it. Alright, still with me. Good. That means we're right where we want to be. Somewhere between mildly interested and very relaxed. So let's keep drifting. No sharp turns. No dramatic reveals. Just a slow walk through a world where lawmakers genuinely believed they could legislate human behavior, and then got frustrated when humans continued to behave like humans. Naturally, this leads us to bathing. Or rather, not bathing, but talking about bathing, and regulating it, because medieval attitudes toward cleanliness were complicated. Public bathhouses existed. They were common. They were social spaces. And for a while, they were perfectly normal. People bathed together, talked, relaxed, probably judged each other quietly. And then moral panic set in. Bathhouses became associated with immorality, with temptation, with disease, with far too much enjoyment happening in warm water, which was suspicious. So laws appeared, regulating who could attend, when, under what circumstances, sometimes banning them outright, especially mixed-gender bathing, because apparently that was just asking for trouble. The irony, of course, is that banning bathhouses often made hygiene worse. But medieval lawmakers were not especially concerned with irony. They were concerned with sin. So bathing became something to regulate, or discourage, or moralize. And that tells us something important. Medieval law didn't just care what you did. It cared how much you enjoyed it. Now let's float from water to sleep. Yes, sleep. In some towns, there were rules about when you could sleep. Or rather, when you were expected to be awake. Night watches existed. Fire prevention mattered, so someone had to stay alert. If you were found asleep during your assigned watch, punishments followed. Fines, public shame, sometimes worse. There were also expectations about sleeping arrangements. Servants slept where they were told. Apprentices slept in workshops. Privacy was rare. Solitude was suspicious. And if you wandered at night, again, suspicion. Always suspicion. Because medieval law assumed that darkness equaled danger. And danger required regulation. Let's drift onward. Toward sound. Noise laws existed. Bells, drums, shouting, music. All regulated. Because noise gathered people. And gatherings were unpredictable. Some towns restricted bell ringing. Others limited street music. Others banned shouting after dark. Even crying could be regulated. Excessive public mourning was sometimes frowned upon. Especially for women, because emotional displays were disruptive, or manipulative, or just uncomfortable. Grief, it turns out, was supposed to be quiet. Which brings us gently to emotion. Yes, medieval law also had opinions about feelings. Anger, for example, public anger could be punished. Insults, arguments, shouting matches, these were offenses. There were laws against scolding, which usually targeted woe.